Welcome to the Hey Mom podcast. This show is hosted by me, Audrey, and my sister Rhoda. Every episode, we will be interviewing our mom. She is our permanent guest. If you have a dilemma, problem, or situation you want a new perspective on, please write in and we will share it on the show. As always, you will remain anonymous. Please email us at heymompodcast121@gmail.com or DM us on our Instagram. Our handle is heymom_podcast. That's all lowercase. Thank you so much and enjoy the show. Hey, Mom. So today we're talking about victimhood. Big topic, especially because I feel like in our day and age, being a victim is like a good thing. And it's celebrated. And it's kind of been interesting to see it turn into that.
Right.
And people my age, mid-20s, I feel like are all captured by the spirit of victimhood. And so I guess my first question for you is, what is, guess the definition of a victim? Because right now it can mean a lot of things, but what do you think it means in its essence?
It means feeling powerless. That's its most essential meaning for me, is when you feel powerless, especially over parts of your life or your body or your experience that you normally have power over. So anything that makes you feel powerless is a form of victimization. So you feel victimized by that thing that is causing you to feel powerless. So you can feel like a victim to your seasonal allergies. And, as an example. So victimization is something that happens to the individual. It's an experience for the individual. It's not always something that someone else is doing to you. Although you can be victimized by other people, obviously.
Right. And then there's like the most basic definition of what am I trying to say? Like being a victim of a tornado or a tsunami.
Like a natural disaster.
Or like even being mugged or, murder victims.
Right.
But I know that a lot of people who survive interactions like that like to be more referred to as survivors rather than victims. Because there's such like that negative.
Well, so victimization implies powerlessness, and the survivor is saying, I'm not powerless. This experience did not determine who I became and what my future is. So they're reclaiming the power piece and letting go of the victimization piece, which I think is wise and healthy.
So we've talked a lot about victimhood, and it's probably not very wise to get into it all right now because our listeners probably won't know all the backstory, but we've talked a lot about how victimhood is a part of the human experience, and every single person has a victim, an inner victim. And so how do you get in touch with that inner victim? And also, what's like the function of a victim, of having it? Like, why can't we just not have it in our lives?
For me, it's a developmental process that happens usually in like pre-adolescent and the adolescent period of a person's life. According to my observations, I've noticed that this is when people talk about feeling victimized for the first time. And this was my experience too. Young children don't internalize the thing that's happening to them through a victim lens. It's still terrible, and they might dislike what's happening to them, whether they don't have enough food to eat, whether, they're in an accident, anything that causes that feeling of powerlessness. For children, little children, it is not internalized and identified as me, something about me. It's just something that happened. And when you hit that preteen, 10, 11, 12, those ages, it seems to activate this sense of victimization, like, why did that happen to me
Mm-hmm.
versus that other person? And that sense of powerlessness becomes part of your identity instead of this bad thing happened. I didn't like how I felt, but I'm fine now, which is more how a young child interprets the experience. The older child begins to identify with it and take it on as, I'm powerless. I can't do anything. This is something happening to me. Instead of just neutral, this is something that is happening. And I think it's an important developmental stage for children to go through because it's the beginning of the development of empathy and being able to put yourself in another person's shoes, like in a more conscious way. I think compassion as an emotion and a human response, I think that's instinctive. I think even the smallest children have compassion as part of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to just separate the concept of empathy from compassion, which little children can have, and you are born, I believe, with the human instinct for compassion.
Mm.
You can cultivate compassion as you mature and you can develop it and exercise it, but it is through empathy, the conscious decision to empathize, which does require you to be a bit older and have more cognitive abilities to be able to do that. And so for me, the function of the victim is that first taste of what it feels like to be another person. This is what it feels like to suffer in this way. And then you might look at someone else who's suffering and be able to connect. Oh, I know what it feels like to be the kid in school that everyone is ignoring. I know what that feels like. And if you don't have a reference point for that, then you don't really have empathy. You can't really develop empathy. So
Yeah.
for me, the victim is valuable because it begins to cultivate our empathetic skills.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I know. When you were talking, all I can think about is high school, junior high and high school, and why it is such a sometimes traumatic experience for people.
Oh, yeah.
It is because we're just all victims, hurting each other. I think about people who are bullied in school and how it's like it becomes a part of their identity to be bullied, and the way high school kids can just be so ruthless, like they don't have empathy.
Yes, because they're in the process of developing it. It's that opportunity for the cultivation of empathy, but you are going to also see perpetrators.
Yes. Yeah. Which is kind of
And
the other
be a
side.
perpetrator.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like even in subtle ways, you can be a perpetrator.
Well, the victim is a perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
So I shouldn't say that exactly. The victimhood, the identification with victim is a perpetration against others in some way. Just being victimized, no, I don't mean that that's also a perpetrator. It's when we cling to and attach our identity to the concept of victim, or we get caught in a victim spiral,
Mm-hmm.
which I experienced many times as well. That is also a perpetrator. So, an example of this is when something bad happens to someone and they turn around and complain about what happened to them to everyone around them, and it's the only topic on the table for the next week. And every time you see that person, they want to tell you again how bad it was and how angry they are, or how awful the person who did whatever they did was. And everyone starts to feel a bit like a victim themselves. and they have this sense of irritation and like, why can't they just shut up about what happened to them already? And it's very easy to miss that that victim is now creating more victims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I experienced that with a group of friends, and all we talked about was just like, for one, other people and how other people were victimizing us, basically. Like we were the victims, almost collectively.
Hmm.
And then it just got so bad to a point where I was like, I don't even like who I am when I'm with these people, with this group of friends. And we need to start talking about different things. And luckily, we did kind of push past it. But so it's made me more sensitive to talking about, like, just staying in that victim mentality. Like, even if it's subtle, sometimes it's hard to know, especially with that example you said about the victim sharing and oversharing, repetitively complaining, like all that stuff. And it's so subtle to pick up on, oh, I don't feel good. Like, I don't feel good. It didn't even happen to me.
But you're being victimized almost secondhand
Yeah.
by that person's experience. And that's just one way that the victim victimizes other people. That you also have entitlement as a form of victimization. That a person can feel entitled to all sorts of things because of this thing that happened to them or this attitude that they had to deal with.
Yeah. And I'm going to share this story real quick. When I worked as a barista, we had this customer and she was in a wheelchair and she 1000% victim. Like she lived her life from a place of victimhood. She would come in and just start making demands. Not even like requests, like, I want my coffee this way. Please bring it to my table, like demands. And I was like, I was shocked. It literally doesn't make sense. What? And you could tell when you looked at her, she was helpless. She was powerless. She was in this wheelchair. She was in chronic pain. And so, yeah, you almost want to feel bad for her. But like when her entitlement started showing, we were just like, oh my gosh, get this person out of here. Get her what she wants, get her away. Like,
You started to feel like a victim around her.
yes, yes. And there was this handicap table that she always used. And she would get really upset if other people were there. On the off chance she showed up to our store, our coffee shop.
Like you were supposed to just keep the
Yeah.
table unoccupied.
Yeah, and she kind of like look at whoever was sitting there and kind of give him the stink eye or kind of like tell our store manager, I need that table. And I hated that sometimes we would just have to give in because we're in a place of business and we're not in a position to kick people out. Like we weren't, especially this company I was working for did not allow for any of that.
Right.
But I always felt bad because she didn't come in very often. And we had these other two customers who were there all the time. And they would just like move their stuff out of the way because she was making them feel guilty and feeling probably victimized. And they're like packing up all their computer stuff and like moving elsewhere. And it just like, I just had the ickiest feeling.
What do you think would be a better way for her to have handled that? That wasn't victimizing and wasn't in a victim mindset for her?
I mean, I don't know if this is kind of the right answer, but just her attitude. I think her attitude was so negative. When she walked in, she had a frown on her face. She was just victimized by her situation. You could just tell. It was like oozing from her. And so I think if she would have been more like lighthearted, considerate, I'm sure she could have went to the other customers there and be like, hey, is it okay if I take this table? I'll buy you a coffee. Like I just don't have very many options to sit. How would you feel if I did this in exchange? Like something like that would have been like, oh, fine, perfectly fine. But I think the big red flag is people's energy and the attitude they come with. Because I had lots of customers like that who were not in wheelchairs,
Who were entitled and
who were
victimized.
entitled and victimized, but it was very well disguised because they were total assholes.
Right.
And like, I was like, oh, they're kind of like perpetrators in their own way, but they're masking behind all of this
Yeah.
other stuff.
While you were talking, I was just thinking about what it would feel like to be her and to come into a store in your wheelchair and feel different and not like everyone else. And maybe you're interpreting everyone looking at you. You take up more room.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your wheelchair is like taking up a lot more space. And the awkwardness of that, of having to order your coffee from a wheelchair where you're
Definitely.
kind of down lower and maybe even feeling inferior, just stature wise. You're not up high, you're kind of diminished
Mm-hmm.
by your position. And how that entitlement that she was exhibiting was a misguided attempt at assertiveness or feeling powerful when she wasn't, when she was feeling all of these ways, and to make demands and to, request or, as you were saying, expect
Mm-hmm.
you to just bring her coffee to her. And
Yeah, she was really fussy too. Like, it was like we were dancing around her trying to make her happy so she would go away. And it kind of sounds bad, but like, that's just kind of what we had to do with people like that.
right, because it's a place of business and,
Yeah.
and all of that. But looking at it through the compassionate lens and also holding her responsible for her behavior,
Yeah.
you can see that it was this misguided attempt to find a feeling of power.
Definitely.
But I'm sure she left those experiences feeling just as helpless and powerless. Even if someone did give up their table, even if the barista brought her perfect coffee exactly the way that she wanted it. And I guess the point I'm making is that it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And these attempts, whether it's entitlement, whether it's pity, trying to get someone's pity, they're all attempts at managing this terrible experience of powerlessness that is the victim. But they just don't work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good lens to look at it. I didn't actually think about that. The compassionate lens that you brought up. So that's really cool. I wonder if is that why this kind of sounds bad, but I'm just gonna say it. I'm sure a lot of people will understand what I mean, but like why homeless people are so hard to look at sometimes. Because they're living in a place of powerlessness.
Yeah, in many ways, it's our neediness as human beings on display.
Yeah.
Our fears are on display. And so you see someone who is unkempt and hungry, desperate, in need. And I think it triggers our survival instincts because we don't want that to be us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all know deep down that we're all helpless and powerless and in need of others. And we can be quite uncomfortable with that reality that we need one another
Yeah.
and we can't do it alone. Even that homeless person needs people to stop and give him or her money, or,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a need. Even if they're not asking for it, you're recognizing human need and human desperation or human, I'm not sure of the right word, but this survival, that you're not able to thrive, you're just surviving. You're just barely keeping warm enough to not die during the night in the winter. And I think that triggers a lot of those survival mechanisms that we have.
Mm.
And we don't want to look at it.
So it's like a different avenue of not quite related to the victim. Do you think it can make people feel victimized with these?
Yes, because they are victims in a sense that there's this powerlessness. that they're experiencing. And every homeless person has a different story. And so I'm not, making blanket statements about it.
Right. No, definitely. Neither am I.
But I do think that the important part is, do I feel victimized by their presence?
Mm.
And am I becoming entitled when I'm walking down a street in a big city and there's homeless people everywhere, and then I find myself acting entitled and indifferent and even bratty?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why can't the city get this cleaned up? And it's an easy thing to overlook, that I am feeling victimized. I am an entitled victim at the mere sight of another victim.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how quickly we get caught up in the virality of victimization.
Yeah. What do you think about? This is kind of a little sidestep. What about people who have to justify their victimization? Because, like, I don't want it to sound like I don't view, and I know you don't, victimization as black and white. Like, being a victim's bad, never be a victim, never live your life. Like, that's just not possible. Everyone does experience this, whether you are aware of it or not. And so, what I don't want people to hear this and feel like, oh, well, they just don't believe that victims are real, because they are. Like, things happen to people that are out of their control. But, like, what about when you have to justify your victimization? I know that's not really a question, but, like, what do you think about that?
What's an example of someone justifying their victimization?
Well, well, I guess you could use the customer in the wheelchair at the coffee shop that like, well, it's not my fault I have this condition. It's not my fault. This basically makes what I'm doing, but okay. You know?
Right. I think I understand what you mean now. Justifying her entitled behavior.
Yeah. Like justifying your bad behavior. Whether
Yeah.
it's entitlement, self-pity, perpetrating. I don't know. It wasn't really a question. I guess it was just a thought I had.
Well, I think I'm tracking you. What I notice is that the justification is connected to not believing that you have power. And now you're needing to justify your behavior because you don't have the same kind of power other people have. You can't walk on your own two legs in the way that most everyone in the coffee shop is walking. So you're feeling powerless about that.
Mm.
And it's something that you didn't want and you don't really have a lot of control over, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so this other behavior, which is an attempt to feel power, needs to be justified.
Mm.
The problem is it isn't real power.
Yeah.
Therefore, it needs justification and support and props in order to sustain itself, because real power doesn't require that.
Yeah. And I think you can kind of tell with someone who is disabled or has a limitation of some sort physically, you can tell in their presence if they have power.
Yeah.
Versus when they don't.
And that's a personal journey of discovery.
Yeah.
Because if you've experienced victimization at that level where like a mobility or a function has been robbed of you by an accident or birth or who knows what else, that can feel so unjust. Again, why me?
Mm-hmm.
Why did this happen to me and not someone else?
Yeah.
And that's a common phrase for victims. So we've all been victimized.
Mm-hmm.
In one form or another. It is a universal experience. We all know what it feels like. And if we can take our experiences and use that feeling of victimization to develop the skill of empathy and know that victimization is part of the human condition, you will be victimized again. And maybe you experience your victimization for shorter periods of time, which has been what's happened with me. It's not that I don't feel victimized anymore. It's just that I spend less time struggling in a state of victimization because I learned this practice.
Mhm.
And the first thing that I do when I'm feeling victimized is I turn that lens of empathy toward myself, because that's usually the first person that gets re victimized after a situation has happened. So, say I'm in an argument with my husband and he says something hurtful, and I can feel the feeling of victimization just like surge up through my body, and the sense of overwhelm that that creates. Shut down, or for me, it's often just shutting down. Other people might find themselves lashing out in ways that doesn't feel true to who they are. Like they'll say something they don't mean. There's all these different ways that we respond to victimization, but I'll feel that surge of victimization come up in me. And instead of jumping right over to trying to have empathy for him and figure out why he said what he did, that's not the proper place to start. The proper place is to turn the lens of empathy on yourself first, because you're the initial sufferer. And how are you really going to be able to connect with and have compassion for that other person if you're still wounded and wincing and uncomfortable and in emotional pain? It's not going to be real. It's going to be a false show of compassion in an attempt to try to make this victimizing feeling go away.
Again, you're like kind of punching yourself at the same time. Like
Right.
just like again, you're not looking at who's the victim here.
Right. So you're re-victimizing yourself
Mhm.
if you're unable to bring that empathy to yourself first. So a practice that I've done that I found really helpful was looking at myself through a lens of innocence. So how am I innocent in this situation? As well as taking responsibility for my behavior. So those two things don't have to compete, and you can hold both of them simultaneously. So let's say in that situation, my husband says something that hurts my feelings. I feel the victimization come up and I start shutting down. Maybe I walk away, which is also a common pattern for me. I'll be mid conversation. I'll get my feelings hurt. Boom, I'm out of there. And I know it's a protective coping mechanism. And the first thing that I'll do is, why did you do that? What's the matter with you? Why couldn't you just stay in the conversation? Why did you have to shut down like a baby? Like, what's wrong with you? And you can see the victimizing of the self immediately. So now I'm victimizing me and reinforcing that feeling of victimization.
Yeah.
But when I turn that lens of kindness, compassion, innocence, how was I innocent in that situation? Then I might look at myself and say, I've been hurt a lot, and the only way that I learned how to protect myself from hurt was to walk away. Or maybe I know that if I reach a certain point of feeling hurt and wounded by another person, I will say something that I regret. And so that lens of innocence is showing me that in that moment, with all of my abilities or lack thereof, I did the very best I could, allows me to hold that space of care that the victim actually needs, and that I can still be responsible for walking away from the conversation and recognizing that that didn't actually solve anything, that didn't help anything. If I want to do something different the next time, then I can explore ways that I might have handled it differently, but doing it with that comfort and care, that self-care that I've surrounded myself with. Like, you handled this well, considering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How would you like to do it differently in the future? How could you stay in that conversation a little bit longer? How could you speak to your experience in a way that alerts the other person about how you're feeling? Maybe they didn't mean to step on your toes, or, so it gets into complicated territory. There are boundaries and other things that we've discussed
Right.
already.
Yeah.
But understanding that you have to turn the lens of empathy on yourself. And most people don't do that. They go right to the other person. But as soon as I feel understood by myself and I'm not judging myself for my behavior anymore, now I can turn it on my husband and say, oh, yeah, I can see how he didn't realize that that would be hurtful. But now there's room for all of us to be viewed through the lens of innocence. Because at a deep level, no one's trying to hurt anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Even people who are mentally ill, and it can seem like that they're trying to hurt others. Deep down inside, they're just trying to meet their own needs, even if those needs are sadistic,
Mm-hmm.
even if they need to be locked up
Mm-hmm.
and society protected from them. I think, and maybe I'm naive in my belief in humanity here, I just think that fundamentally there's just a seed of goodness that is just as powerful in us as a seed of darkness and ugliness. And if that ugliness is there, so is the good.
Absolutely. That lens of compassion and innocence, as you said, the lens of innocence,
Mm-hmm.
so useful. I was just thinking about how I don't do that. I a lot of times try to jump to the empathy for the other person, and it just puts me back into the cycle. Because you're almost at the mercy of what they're going to do or the person you feel victimized by.
You're still hurt.
Yeah.
And this way it empowers you to take care of your own pain.
Yeah.
And not require that other person to apologize or
Mm-hmm.
come chase you down and say, what's wrong? What's wrong?
I do that so bad. Yeah. Well, I'm going to back up a little bit. Sorry. So say someone's listening to this and hopefully they're not feeling too uncomfortable, they won't turn it off. But say they live in a victim mentality. What are some signs that people can, questions ask themselves about if they're living in a victimhood mentality?
Well, the first thing that I would say is your environment and your situation that you're living in part of the problem? Are you being victimized? Because there are people who are in situations where they're constantly unsafe. And it's really hard to create a bubble of safety around yourself if you don't even know what it feels like to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
And to be comfortable and to deserve care and kindness and all of that. So if you're not in an environment where you have some degree of safety, it's very, very difficult. And you need to be able to provide that for yourself as a starting point. But having said that, there are situations you may find yourself in where there is no obvious out. I keep thinking of Viktor Frankl in the concentration camps. Total victimization.
Mm-hmm.
In every possible way. Every human dignity is stripped from you, and you have nothing, no autonomy, no personal freedom. You can't speak. You can't even control what you're eating, what you're doing, how you're being treated. It's the ultimate victimization. And yet, there's a place to find your personal power even in those situations. So I'm talking about extreme examples. Most people can't get out of a victimizing environment until they at least find a tiny shred of personal power. Because it's hard to believe that there is personal power. Why would I try to get out of this situation if I don't feel empowered at all? If you're completely helpless. But I believe that we're never completely helpless, especially as adults. Children, that's another story.
Yeah.
But for adults, I think there is a place where you do have power, and that is how I respond to what's happening to me. Nobody can touch that. Nobody can decide what you're going to think about another person. No one has any control over that, no matter how much they have power over your body and over all of your other experiences. As an adult, no one can tell you how to think about what's happening to you. Now, your environment influences it. I don't want to dismiss that, but there is power. We do have power in every situation, any situation that we're in. And so if someone is in a relatively safe environment, but they're feeling victimized all the time, then that's a bit simpler, because then you're not trying to confront an external force that is constantly robbing you of your opportunities to access your own power.
Yeah, and that kind of connects to, that was my next question about, what about those people who are in that relatively safe environment who it's more subtle. Like, I've even experienced that at work, at one of my jobs, that I'm like, why am I feeling like a victim? Like, no one's forcing me to be here. No one's forcing me to interact with these people, these coworkers, And I guess that kind of connects with, I had another question. Why is our culture focusing so much on victimhood? Like, why is it a badge of honor these days where people opt for being a victim to almost fit in certain circles,
Well, victimization is so very human.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we're dealing with a strange phenomena with this. I think that in the past, we were busy surviving.
Yeah.
We didn't really have time to worry about these little issues like what you're describing at work. I don't go to work, I don't eat.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't eat, I die.
Yeah.
So I think we're in a place of such luxury and comfort and abundance that these victimizing experiences, which are human, which are part of our human condition, do seem to become woven into our day-to-day experience. And so I don't know that I have an answer for why it's a badge of honor these days, except that you get to belong to a club.
Mm-hmm.
And if everybody is a victim, we all get to be victims together, and we're very tribal.
Right. And I actually thought about something that after I asked that question, like grief groups, AA groups, and recovery groups. Like, there's support groups where people have all experienced the same type of victimization in a way.
Right.
And I was like, oh, that's actually different. That would, for some people, most people, that's an empowering experience.
Right.
To belong to.
Because that's
people.
the empathy piece.
Yeah.
Those examples you gave are examples of people experiencing the empathy that is absolutely necessary for turning that victim experience into a return to your personal power, so that that helplessness and that feeling of overwhelm that is so consistent with victimization is overcome.
Yeah.
It is the empathy. It's the understanding that that person sitting across the room from me gets it.
Mm-hmm.
And even just being able to, again, turn that lens back on yourself. You might hear someone else's story that's very similar to yours, and yet you find yourself having all this compassion and care for them. And then you notice, oh, I have compassion for them, but I'm not holding the same degree of compassion for myself. Those groups get formed for the same reason that victim groups get formed.
Mm-hmm.
It's just they're more empathy groups
Mm-hmm.
rather than victim groups. But it's in our nature to seek out birds of a feather,
Right.
as the saying goes.
I guess I'm going to bring it back to this. Like, how does someone know that they're in a victim mentality? Do you just have to feel like garbage all the time? Like, is it I know you talked about the environment, and that's a super important aspect. What about relationships? Like people who are in your life that make you feel victimized.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. That feeling of powerlessness. We're very, very sensitive to the moment we feel disempowered. In any situation, take traffic. You're stuck in traffic.
So disempowering.
The second traffic slows down, or you find a slower driver and you're unable to move to another lane, you feel the feeling of victimization come up immediately. And that victimization is powerless. I'm doing this driving and I'm trying to go somewhere, and now I am disempowered to be able to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't see a way forward. I don't know how to get out of this, which is why you see people driving on shoulders and doing kind of crazy, risky stuff, because the feeling of powerlessness is so uncomfortable that to avoid it, we will often become a perpetrator, which is exactly what reckless drivers who are zipping around and changing lanes too quickly and speeding and all of that, they're trying to avoid that feeling of powerlessness and victimization.
And is it the same for people who road rage? Like in extreme cases, like get out of their car and pick fights with people?
Absolutely. It's
So crazy.
it's just a victim.
It's like you don't have road rage, you're just victimized.
Yep.
It's so funny. Oh, that's so good.
So that sensing that feeling of powerlessness,
Yeah.
whatever causes it, is the thing to notice. Ah, I'm feeling powerless. Okay, empathy for the self, first of all. So maybe if I'm in traffic and I'm feeling a little bit irritated, I'm like, well, what's got you upset? Why does traffic slowing down, which is really no one's fault,
Mm-hmm.
there's no finger to be pointed at anyone. Oftentimes it's a car accident. Someone's life has just been forever altered. And I'm, 10 cars back complaining about having to drive 10 miles an hour for 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you look at it in the bigger picture, it seems silly and ridiculous. But in that moment when you're feeling that way, all you have to do is just turn that lens back to you and start to
Kind of investigate.
Yes.
I was going to say, what are some questions someone can ask themselves with the empathy lens pointed at them?
I mean, I think first of all, acknowledging that how you feel is valid without excusing it or making it acceptable. So if I'm in traffic, and I'm going to use this example because it's so simple and I still find myself irritated in traffic. I think it's probably one of the most common ways we feel victimized. That I'll notice myself having these negative thoughts. This slow person, why aren't they driving faster? And why did I get behind every slow person on the road today? And I'll hear this voice in my head that's talking this way, sometimes out loud, even if I'm by myself. And so I'll say, what's up with you? What's going on? What is it happening inside of you? And then I'm like, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to be late because I left the house and I wasn't quite ready and I was a bit frazzled. And I'm afraid that the place that I'm going to, whether it's a doctor's appointment or I'm meeting a friend somewhere. I'm feeling stressed about meeting my obligations or being able to do what I said that I would do. And as soon as I have that awareness, then I'm able to reassess. Like, oh, is this actually going to make me late? Or am I almost just habitually feeling this way when I'm still going to make it on time? And it's clear that I'm going to make it on time. So being able to look at myself that way, I can calm right down. And then I can strategize for, oh, I am going to be late. I do have a doctor's appointment. Maybe I better call and say, hey, I'm running late. How long can you hold my appointment? And immediately I'll feel this sense of calm come over me. I don't need the person in front of me to drive faster. And most of the time, I have to add, it's for no reason whatsoever. I don't need to get somewhere. I'm going to the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if I'm going to be there 10 minutes later or whatever. It's the feeling of powerlessness that I'm confronting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in resistance to that there are some things in life where you don't have control. And so I go to that state of acceptance. It's like, I don't actually have control over that driver in front of me. And so I accept what's happening without any resistance. I mean, this is what I tell myself. I don't always do it. But
yeah, I've experienced that too. Recently, it was last winter. I got stuck in a super bad traffic. It was the first snow, so that the roads were not primed with salt or anything like that. So the roads became really treacherous, and I was stuck on my 20-minute commute, and it took me 3.5 hours to get home.
ooh,
But because I was so stuck, I kind of went into this place of acceptance, and I treated like every, I don't know, mile like a win. Like I was like, okay. And there's this big hill that had tons of ice on it. It was terrifying, like people sliding backwards. It was horrible. But I made up the hill and I just had that feeling of like, it's going to be okay. My car is safe. We're going to do it. Just be careful. Like I was totally in this place of, it felt empowering. Because it's funny because my sister Rhoda was on the same commute home. And so her and I were talking on the phone the whole time. And she was spiraling. Like, oh my gosh, this is worse. Like, my car's gonna slide backwards, like freaking out. And then, so hearing her have her experience helped me ground myself and like, everything's gonna be okay. It's like that empathy. It's like a blanket of empathy. It's like, you're good. Even if we did slide backwards and fell off the side of the road, people are around me who are stuck in traffic too. I'm sure I could catch a ride with someone,
You're all in it together.
Yeah, we're all in it together.
And that reminds me of like you're mentioning the support groups.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you were experiencing it empathetically.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're all scared.
Mm-hmm. We're
all worried. We're all trying to navigate these conditions.
Yeah, and so it kind of turned out to be an empowering experience, but it sounds so weird. But it could have been the worst experience of my life. But it really wasn't. It really wasn't.
Right. And I think that empathy piece is key
Mm-hmm.
because the empowering quality that you experienced was a direct result of first being kinder to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, you're doing the best you can here. You're just driving and these conditions are poor and then you extended that out to everyone else.
Yeah.
And then you found yourself looking at your progress as a win instead of it's about time.
Right. Yeah, and it completely transformed my perception of that experience looking back on it. And even the guy in front of me was like sliding all over the place, and I was just like, and I kind of jumped to like, if he slides backward and hits me, it's gonna be fine. Like, it was weird. I kind of talk about it now, like it was the worst experience ever because it was so stressful. But now that you're using the traffic as a metaphor for victimization, it kind of makes a lot of sense. Like, oh, that was an actually really interesting and cool experience because of the empathy lens I had on it.
Yeah, and recognizing everyone's innocence.
Yes.
So I think the weather gave you that extra component Because normally when you're driving and the sun is shining and the roads are dry and the person in front of you is driving slow, or maybe they're a little erratic, or do we have compassion and empathy for them? Usually not.
No.
They're usually an idiot.
Yeah, I see that a lot when I'm driving.
But if we could apply that lens of innocence to the drivers without knowing,
Mm-hmm.
is it possible that there's a 85-year-old grandma who is doing her absolute best, and it's pretty cool that she still has her independence and
Mm-hmm.
is on the road, and I'm okay. What if that was my grandma? I'm glad I'm driving behind this person so that I can be patient and not be that person that's going to honk at her or make her feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
What if someone's rushing somewhere, and you can go through these scenarios of empathy and care after you apply it to yourself. After you're like, it's going to be okay. Like, it's okay that you're a little frustrated. You just, had a really tough morning. And now you're kind of blowing off some steam and you're venting on these drivers from the privacy of your enclosed vehicle.
Yeah.
And understanding what's going on and being caring toward yourself. It's like, oh, that's why. I don't want to take out this frustration on my kids, so I'm kind of yelling at the drivers in the
Mm-hmm.
cab of my vehicle. Then you find yourself calming down and feeling more love and just general well-being toward others because you applied it to yourself.
Yeah, that's really. I still need to practice that.
I need to practice that. I
Yeah.
think it is all of our responsibility as human beings to do that. And it's a practice. It is something that you just do for the rest of your life.
Not a destination you arrive at.
You're not going to get somewhere where you never experience that ever again, but I don't think. But like I was saying earlier, the time I spend in a state of victimization has just gotten shorter as I've matured and I've practiced this, so that I'm not caught in the whirlpool of victimization, because there were times in my life where I would just spiral down, down, down. And once I got caught in the victim whirlpool, and that's exactly what it feels like,
Mm-hmm.
it was so hard to pull myself out of it. I wanted to be victimized. I wanted that self-pity. It was like I was craving it, and I didn't want to feel empowered anymore. And I didn't want someone telling me, you actually have power in this situation. I'd be like, shut up. I'm in the middle of my victim story here, and you're interrupting it. You're ruining it.
Yeah. Do you think it's because there's such a lack of empathy you have for yourself that you need the victimization to kind of gratify that?
I think in this specific situation I'm talking about, where self-pity was the spiral, and I felt so uncared for that the self-pity was a substitute, and it felt better than nothing. And so I came to realize that self-pity was an attempt at caring for myself, at that kindness and compassion, but it just didn't do a great job. It was a substitute, though. Feeling sorry for myself was better than not feeling sorry for myself and continuing to feel victimized, continuing to feel helpless and powerless. At least if I felt sorry for myself, someone cared about me. Someone was feeling something for me in my plight.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, looking at myself through that lens, I saw that even my self-pity and even my pathetic behavior was understandable, and I could bring that care and consideration to that part of me. It's like, oh, I'm just trying to take care of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to feel what I'm longing other people to feel for me.
So even in your worst moments, try to look at yourself through that empathy lens.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
And,
really hard to do.
and it needs, yeah, it is. It needs to make sense, though.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just say, well, you know, I have a right to feel this way. And the reason I feel this way is because that person treated me this. That's not compassion. That's just self pity. And it's just reinforcing that you get to feel how you feel. You get to remain powerless, and it's justified.
And it kind of connects to the power and control idea that we've already touched on. We did an episode on power control. So the powerlessness, that's directly what we're talking about. So if you're trying to control everything and you're a victim, you're probably not very fun to be around.
Exactly. And you are going to opt for controlling methods
Mm-hmm.
because it does give you that false sense of power. And sometimes the victim uses, well, withdrawal for me, that was my pattern, to try to control the other person's behavior. If I withdraw, I'm trying to control their desire to come find me because they might be thinking, what did I do? And did I hurt her feelings? And it never happened, by the way.
Yeah, I also struggle with that.
Yeah. And then it reinforces the feeling that that person fixed how I was feeling inside of me. And that is not true.
Mm-hmm.
You decided it was okay to let go of your victimization. That person didn't do anything. And you can decide that whether that person responds the way that you want them to or not. It's hard. It's hard because you have to give up that feeling of victimization. And I don't think it can be successfully done without having that empathetic perspective towards yourself. You can't just discipline yourself into not being a victim. You can make it look like you're not a victim, but then you become a perpetrator and entitled and these other behaviors and victimize other people in your attempt to toughen yourself up and pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
I feel like, again, I'm generalizing here. Not everyone is going to feel this way, but a lot of men do that.
Mm.
Because especially in a culture where it's not okay to be empathetic toward yourself, or it might look weak to other men,
Right.
to look at yourself through that lens.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, there's so many examples of men who it just like leaks out in other ways. Like
Right.
they're bullies to their families or other people,
Right.
isolate themselves because I don't know why, but like you just see it.
Behind every perpetrator is a victim.
Yeah.
I think of that as two sides of the same coin.
Just humor me for a minute before we close out this episode. Do you believe in nature versus nurture as far as like serial killers and people who do really bad things? Because I just don't believe that it doesn't come from nowhere. Like it has to come from somewhere. So I'm a little bit more on the nurture side of the aisle than nature.
Well, since I don't actually know any serial killers, I can't speak to any kind of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my position on this, if I'm going to be audacious and have a position,
Mm-hmm.
would just be that I think that we're a combination of our biology and our environment. And that is sort of the nature versus nurture. I'm more nature and nurture.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we put too much emphasis on the biology part because it's so disturbing that we don't know where to put it. We don't want to look at the possibility that environments can amplify or encourage some of this horrific behavior. We don't want to see ourselves in the serial killer. We don't want to empathize with someone who's doing these horrendous acts. And I think that there's value in being able to look at yourself through that lens of possibility. And not from a biological perspective, not what if I didn't what if my brain didn't work in the right way and I didn't have empathy and I was able to just indulge these impulses? I'm not looking at it like that, but rather, what am I capable of? And acknowledge that we're all capable of great evil.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only through the acknowledgement of it that we have any kind of power over that. And of course, that's extreme,
But
but we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
I can have empathy for myself as a bad driver, an impatient driver, then that's just on a very small scale of acknowledging that I am capable of being an asshole on the road,
Mm-hmm.
like everyone else, and have probably done that
Mm-hmm.
and just don't want to look at it.
Yeah.
So, on a small scale, there's value in doing that. I don't think we all need to explore what it would take for us to become serial killers.
Mm-mm.
That I don't necessarily see that as helpful, but I do think the idea of what am I capable of, and acknowledging that we're all capable of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only in that acknowledgement of our dark side that we're able to manage it. I sometimes tell people I like to keep the devil right on my shoulder, right where I can see him. Because it's when I can't see the devil that I start to wonder, maybe I'm behaving like the devil now.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was very insightful. I learned more about victimhood. So thank you for being here and talking to us about that, Mom. I guess we'll talk about it more in the future, huh?
There's a lot more to say on this topic.
Okay. Thank you.